Hey guys, today let's talk about magical realism. So I'm basically doing this video because I'm a very petty human. You might have heard that Maggie Stiefvater is going to write a magical realism book that basically takes place in this town that's called Diablo or something like that, and it's about a Latin American family. This caused like this big discussion on what magical realism is and if people that are not from Latin America or Latinx people can write magical realism. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about magical realism and why I think non-Latinx people writing magical realism is appropriation, especially when you're telling a story from Latin American people. This started as a discussion on Twitter, and there is this blogger who wrote this really amazing article on magical realism and about the genre magical realism. So I'm going to leave in the description. It's from Leah from the blog Reading While Walking, I believe. I'm going to leave her article on the description because a few of my thoughts are based on that article. So magical realism started as a subdivision of the surrealist movement that tried to bring strange and magical things into the everyday life. You can definitely find magical realism in a lot of books and genres from different countries. But when we talk about it as a genre, we can only talk about Latin American magical realism. Why is this, you ask? Well, Latin American people started using magical realism as a way to depict the reality that they were living, with a combination of the new and the traditional, with the new technologies and the superstitions that is ingrained in Latin American culture in a way that is not ingrained in any other culture in the world. The authors wrote it as a way to protest against colonialism and what Garcia Marquez called the Repúblicas Bananeras, which is a pejorative way to call impoverished countries that need from another country to live. So Leah in her article talks about mode. You can definitely use magical realism as a mode in your books, but not as a genre. This genre also has the characteristic of showing emotions not as description of those emotions but as actions. So for example, someone is sad and it rains. It's the aesthetic way of showing the Latin American reality that can only be told from within Latin America. When you're writing magical realism as a genre and telling Latin American stories, you are appropriating Latin American culture. And you can be sure that if you're not from Latin America, we don't need your voice. If Maggie says that she draw inspiration from Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende, we already have those books and I'm sure they are better told than we're Dick. Now here we talked about appropriation. That is the adoption of another culture's elements, and it's inherently wrong because of a question of privilege. There is no doubt that people are going to read Maggie's stories, but not only because she's famous and she has a famous series, but also because she's white and she's from the United States. A lot of privilege there. Ask yourself how many of the readers of those stories actually read Latin American magical realism written by people from Latin America, and then ask yourself, why is that? So now I'm going to tell you some Latinx books that you can read instead of reading her book. If her book is the first magical realism book that you're going to read when you have all these recommendations before that, then you have to ask yourself why you're going to pick that book and you're not going to pick actual Latin American magical realism book. So here I want to recommend anything by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, obviously. So I already did a video of recommendations of Latin American books, so I'm going to leave it here and in the description. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about most of these books. The book that mainly shows what I talk about when I talk about the reaction to colonialism is 100 Years of Solitude, which tells the story of several generations of a family in the most unique way imaginable. Chronicles of a Death Foretold and Of Love and Other Demons are two brilliant books that are super gorgeously told, especially if you're interested in chronicles. My sister, who is a literature professor, argues that only Gabriel Garcia Marquez did magical realism, like pure magical realism, and everything that came after that is post-magical realism. I'm not really sure about that, but everything that I'm going to talk about here came after Garcia Marquez, so there are a lot of ideas that he installed and that people took to their context. So another super important person for magical realism is Isabel Allende. Her most famous book is House of Spirits, and it's definitely a wonderful story. But my favorites are City of Beasts and Eva Luna. Laura Esquivel, Like Water for Chocolate, is a super accessible book that shows the true Mexican culture and superstitions in a way I haven't seen done by anyone else in the same way. Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo is a novel that I didn't like when I first read it, but it intertwines two different times and even life and death beautifully. It's weird and it's going to challenge your intellect, but it talks about identity and heritage in the way that it needs to be talked about, especially when you're telling Latin American stories. For more contemporary books, of course, I had to talk about Anna Marie McLemore. I think she's one of the best authors who is doing magical realism in our times. I think you know, but When the Moon Was Ours is one of my favorite books of all time. It described a lot of the things that I talked about, like feelings described as actions, but also as a manifestation in the character's decisions and way of life. I'm now reading The Weight of Feathers, and it's just as incredible, with even more culture and folklore intertwined with these beautiful words. This month I also read Labyrinth Lost by Zoraida Cordova, and even if I think it's more fantasy or paranormal than magical realism, you can still see the cultural connotations, which in magical realism are more important than the actual genre's characteristics. So like I said, I will leave Leah's article in the description, but please leave in the comments any magical realism books that you've read. I know I'm lacking in a lot of departments in the magical realism and in Latin American culture. I haven't read a lot of books about Central America that are magical realism, but I'm trying to find them. So if you have any of them, please leave them in the comments. And okay, that's everything for today. Hope you like this. If you did, subscribe, and I will see you when I see you. Bye!